"I recognize this woman," my son said, and for one suspended second I forgot how to breathe. The old photograph trembled slightly between Daniel's fingers as the late afternoon sun stretched across my kitchen table, catching on the faded corners. I had not opened those photo albums for years. Not because I was looking for anything in particular, but because age has a quiet way of pulling your thoughts backward. Some women sort closets. Some polish silver. That Thursday I found myself opening dusty boxes of photographs, brushing my fingertips over brittle plastic sleeves, letting old memories rise one by one into the light. The house was still. Only the refrigerator hummed, and every so often the floor let out one of its familiar creaks as the weather shifted. I had lived in that house for 39 years. Long enough to know it sounds the way some women know prayer. Daniel had stopped by unannounced, which he rarely did anymore. He loosened his tie, accepted a cup of coffee, and sat across from me with the distracted air of a man whose mind was always somewhere else. We turned the album pages in silence until he reached for that photograph. It was the kind of picture most people would overlook. Tucked between birthday cakes and Christmas mornings, it showed a woman standing by a white fence, smiling faintly into the camera. Not glamorous. Not dramatic. Just there. But Daniel stared at it a little too long. "I know her," he said again, quieter this time. I did not answer right away. I only looked at the photograph in his hand, then at my son's face. Something in his voice unsettled me. Not certainty exactly. Recognition shaped by suggestion. The kind that does not come from memory alone. After he and Vanessa left, I did not wash the coffee cups. I sat at the kitchen table with the closed album in front of me and listened to the house settle into evening. A branch brushed the window. The heat clicked in the walls. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard sighed. Walter used to say that photographs only showed what people were willing to see. My husband believed many things could be managed with silence, a pressed shirt, and the right tone of voice. He had been gone 4 years, but his absence still lived in the house. In the empty chair by the breakfast table. In the garage where his tools still hung in perfect order. In the space beside me that never truly warmed again. I went back upstairs and pulled the old envelope from the cabinet shelf. The paper was dry and faintly sweet with age. Inside were more photographs, and in nearly every one of them there she was, Margaret Hale, standing beside Walter at church picnics, charity lunches, community events I remembered attending but had never studied closely. She wore the same unreadable smile in every image, as though she knew something the camera could not catch. Then I found the one Daniel had recognized. I turned it over, and there, in Walter's neat handwriting, was a date from 26 years ago and a single word, Concord. My stomach tightened. Concord was not a woman. It was a town in northern Michigan. A place Walter had traveled to twice one summer for what he called supplier meetings. I sat very still, the photograph resting in my lap. At my age, tears do not always come first. Sometimes it is clarity. And that night, for the first time in years, I understood that some secrets do not stay buried because they are gone. They stay buried because no one has touched them. The next morning, I did what I had done for most of my adult life whenever something inside me felt unsteady. I kept to my routine that I woke at 6:30, fed the birds on the back porch, brewed a full pot of coffee even though I would only drink 2 cups, and watered the African violets on the kitchen windowsill. There is dignity in ordinary tasks. They remind you that panic is a luxury, and women who have held families together for decades do not often have the privilege of falling apart the moment truth begins to shift beneath their feet. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed in gray slacks and a pale sweater, the kind of practical outfit that made people underestimate me. I had learned long ago that looking harmless was its own kind of strength. I carried the photograph of Margaret Hale with me all morning, though not in my hand. It stayed in my mind like a splinter under skin. Small. Sharp. Impossible to ignore. Daniel had inherited Walter's broad shoulders and steady hands, but not his patience. Vanessa, on the other hand, had patience in abundance. She used it the way some women polish old furniture, smoothing every surface until the cracks underneath stopped showing. If she had gone looking through family records, old property notes, or church archives, she would not have done it carelessly. That was what troubled me most. Not that Daniel had recognized Margaret, but that he had been prepared to. I stood at the sink longer than necessary, staring out at the backyard. The maple tree Walter planted when Daniel was born moved gently in the wind, its leaves catching the pale morning light. For years I had mistaken calm for safety. I had thought that because my home was quiet it was secure. But quiet things can hide a great deal. Dust in a sealed drawer. Letters in an old envelope. Resentments pass from one person to another in careful, reasonable tones. By noon I had made up my mind. I would not call Daniel and ask questions that would only invite half answers. I would not accuse Vanessa of anything without knowing where she had been digging. And I would not allow myself the comfort of guessing when the truth, however unpleasant, could still be found. If someone had placed Margaret Hale into my son's thoughts, then someone had opened a door that had stayed closed for 26 years. I intended to find out who. So I cleared the breakfast dishes, dried my hands and walked upstairs to the bedroom I had once shared with Walter. This time I was not opening the past to remember. I was opening it to investigate. Walter had always been a careful man. Not warm in any grand theatrical sense. He was not the kind of husband who bought flowers for no reason or filled a room with words just to keep silence away. But he was careful. Careful with money. Careful with promises. Careful with appearances most of all. That was why the things I found later that afternoon unsettled me so deeply. They did not feel accidental. They felt preserved. The envelope was still in the drawer where I had placed it the night before. I carried it to the bed and sat down beneath the soft yellow light of the lamp, the same lamp Walter used to switch off each night before rolling onto his side with a sigh that always sounded heavier than the day required. Inside, the photographs were only the beginning. Beneath them lay a folded receipt from a bed and breakfast in Concord. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the date was still clear. 26 years ago. 2 nights. 1 room. I set it aside and continued. There was a program from a local historical society fundraiser. Margaret Hale's name appeared near the bottom, listed among the event organizers. Walter's name was nowhere on the page, but I had been married long enough to know my husband's habits. He did not keep paper unless it mattered to him. At the bottom of the envelope, I found a newspaper clipping no larger than my hand. A small article tucked onto page 2 of some local paper in northern Michigan. Easy to miss. Easy to save. It mentioned the opening of a women's resource center just outside Concord. Margaret Hale had been named director. I read the clipping twice. Then a third time. Not because the words were difficult, but because I could feel something inside me rearranging itself with each line. Old assumptions shifting quietly out of place. Walter had not simply crossed paths with this woman once or twice. Her name had lived in his private papers. Her face had remained tucked among family memories. Not displayed. Not discarded. Hidden. I did not cry. That may sound cold, but tears were not what came. What came was a kind of stillness. A sharper way of seeing. The kind that arrives when grief has already taught you there are worse things than pain. There is confusion. There is humiliation. There is the slow realization that something important happened inside your marriage, and you were expected to carry on as though silence itself were proof of innocence. I gathered the papers carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Whatever Walter had hidden, he had hidden it neatly. And I was beginning to understand that neatness can be its own form of deception. By evening, the house had grown quieter than usual, though nothing in it had changed. The dishes were done. The counters were wiped clean. The kitchen clock kept its steady rhythm above the doorway. Outside, the last of the light faded behind the maple tree, and the backyard slipped into shadow. Everything looked as it always had. That was the unsettling part. There are moments when the world should look different, when a woman feels it ought to acknowledge that something inside her life has shifted. But houses are loyal to routine. They do not rearrange themselves just because the truth has. I stood at the sink and let my hands rest against the porcelain edge. Then I began quietly to remember. Not the large moments first. Not anniversaries or Christmases or the births and funerals that divide a marriage into neat chapters. It was the smaller things that came back. Walter taking certain phone calls in the garage with the door half closed. Walter ironing one of his good shirts on a Thursday evening when no dinner invitation had been mentioned. Walter returning from those trips to Michigan with that tired, distant politeness men, where when they want gratitude instead of questions. At the time, I had not examined any of it closely. Life had been crowded then. Daniel was still young. My mother needed help after her surgery. There were school forms to sign, casseroles to bake, bills to pay, church commitments to keep. Women of my generation were trained to keep moving. We were taught that if something did not demand immediate attention, it could be folded neatly into the background and dealt with later. Later, of course, is where many truths go to hide. I thought of Margaret's face in those photographs. Not intimate exactly. Not obvious. That would have been easier in a way. No, what troubled me was how ordinary she looked standing beside him. How naturally she seemed to fit into the edge of his world. Like someone who had been there often enough to stop feeling out of place. That was when a colder thought entered my mind. Perhaps the real betrayal was not what had happened. Perhaps it was how skillfully it had been made to appear harmless. I went upstairs and opened Walter's old cedar box, the one I had not touched since the year after he died. Inside were warranty papers, insurance cards, a few old receipts, and the orderly little remnants of a man who had believed in systems. I searched through them slowly, methodically, not because I expected immediate answers, but because I no longer trusted the version of marriage I had lived inside for 40 years. And once a woman stops trusting the silence, she starts hearing everything. Saturday arrived with rain. Not the violent kind, not the sort that rattles windows or bends branches, but a steady silver drizzle that softened the backyard and made the whole house smell faintly of damp earth and old wood. I spent most of the afternoon preparing for Sunday dinner. Peeling potatoes. Trimming carrots. Setting aside the good dishes without fully admitting to myself why I had chosen them. There are moments when a woman knows she is not simply making a meal. She is arranging a stage. I laid out the cream-colored plates from my wedding set, the ones with the thin gold rim I usually saved for holidays. I polished the water glasses until they caught the kitchen light. I folded the napkins into neat squares and placed each fork and spoon with the quiet precision of someone preparing for truth to be spoken under the right conditions. The radio played softly in the background, old standards drifting in and out between the weather report and static. It should have made the house feel warm. Instead, it only sharpened the silence underneath it. I moved through the kitchen slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted every detail under control. The pot roast went into the oven just after noon. By 3, the scent of onions, thyme, and beef had settled into the walls, rich and familiar. On any other weekend it might have felt comforting. That day it felt strategic. I kept thinking about Daniel's face when he held the photograph. Not just surprise. Hesitation. As if he had arrived already carrying part of the answer, and only needed the image to confirm it. And Vanessa, calm, polished Vanessa, had looked at him too quickly before lowering her eyes. A small movement, easy to miss. But once a woman begins to doubt the surface of things, she notices every ripple beneath it. By 4 o'clock, I had done all I could do without moving too early. So I sat in the breakfast nook with my second cup of coffee and stared out at the rain sliding down the glass. Then I reached for the old address book. Walter's handwriting was still there on the inside page. Neat and slanted. Names and numbers written in blue ink from a time when people trusted paper more than passwords. I turned the pages carefully until I found the one name I had been avoiding since the night before. Margaret Hale. My finger rested on the number for a long moment. I told myself I was only confirming facts, only following a trail. But deep down I knew better. I was no longer preparing dinner for my son and his wife. I was preparing to sit at my own table with the past. I called just before 5. I had expected nothing, or perhaps a disconnected line. The flat mechanical voice that tells you the past has moved on without leaving a forwarding address. Instead, the phone rang twice. Then a woman answered. Her voice was older than I expected. Calm. Careful. When I asked if this was Margaret Hale, there was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. Not confusion. Recognition. The kind that settles quietly into the line before either person has decided what version of the truth they are willing to touch. Yes, she said at last. I gave my name. Another silence followed. Not startled. Not defensive. Just heavy. I stood there in my kitchen, one hand wrapped around the receiver, the other resting flat against the counter beside the bowl of peeled potatoes. Rain slipped down the window over the sink in silver threads. The roast was still in the oven, and the house smelled of thyme and onion and memory. I found some old photographs, I told her. My husband kept them. She did not ask which husband. She did not ask what photographs. That told me more than any denial could have. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Softer now. Worn around the edges. There are things your husband never meant to explain, she said. Not because they were shameful. Because they were complicated. Complicated. It is a word people use when the truth threatens to show its bones. I did not press her then. I did not ask the questions waiting in my throat. She gave me only one thing before the call ended. An agreement to meet and a time. Saturday evening. A small diner off the highway, 30 minutes north of town. Neutral ground, she called it. After I hung up, I remained still for a long while. By Sunday, the rain had passed. The sky was bright and clean, as if the world had made a private decision not to concern itself with human secrets. By noon, the porch railing had dried, and pale sunlight stretched across my kitchen floor in long clear bands. I moved slowly through the house, not because I lacked certainty, but because control lives in small details. The table was set. The good dishes waited in their places. The lemon tart Vanessa usually brought sat absent from the counter, and the room felt sharper for it. When Daniel's car finally turned into the driveway, I was standing at the dining room window with my hands folded loosely in front of me. I already knew one thing for certain. My son had not come to satisfy curiosity. He had come because someone had handed him a version of the truth and pointed him toward the evidence. And this time I intended to let him speak first. Vanessa stepped inside first. She was carrying a lemon tart from the bakery downtown, and wearing a pale blue blouse that made her look almost innocent. Almost. Daniel followed a step behind her, shoulders tense beneath his jacket, his expression already guarded in the way people look when they know a conversation has been rehearsed in the car, and still may not survive the table. I greeted them calmly, took the tart from Vanessa's hands, and thanked her as though this were an ordinary Sunday. That is one of the privileges of age. People mistake composure for ignorance. We sat down to dinner with all the rituals still intact. Plates passed. Water poured. The roast carved into careful slices. Sunlight slid across the gold rim of the china, and for a few minutes the three of us moved through the familiar choreography of family life as though none of us had come there carrying hidden intentions. Then Daniel set down his fork. He did not look at Vanessa first. That interested me. Instead, he reached into the folder he had brought and pulled out the photograph. Margaret by the white fence. He laid it on the table between us, like evidence in a room too polite to call itself a courtroom. Vanessa found some things, he said. His voice was low, controlled, but not steady. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate before answering. What things? He swallowed. Old records, property notes, newspaper mentions, family documents. He glanced down at the photograph, then finally toward his wife. She said there were gaps in what Dad told us. She said this woman kept showing up in places connected to Grandpa's side of the family, and later to Dad. Vanessa lifted her chin slightly. It was a very small motion, but I recognized it at once. Not triumph exactly. Something colder. The posture of a woman who believes she has done the difficult work of uncovering what others were too sentimental to see clearly. I never hid anything from Daniel, she said. Her tone was smooth, professional, almost kind. She had always spoken that way when she wanted each word to sound reasonable before anyone had time to examine its motive. I looked at Daniel, not her. That too was deliberate, because Daniel still looked uncertain. Vanessa did not. And there is a difference between someone seeking truth and someone arranging it. I let the silence stretch, just long enough to make all three of us hear it. Then I reached for the cookbook I had placed earlier on the sideboard. Inside it, tucked between the church casserole recipes and Walter's old roast notes, was the letter Margaret had told me to find. I set it gently on the table. If your father left behind gaps, I said, then perhaps it's time you learned why. Daniel read the letter once too quickly. I could tell by the way his eyes moved, skimming rather than absorbing, as if speed might soften the meaning. Then he went back to the top and read it again, slower this time, one line at a time. By the end, the firmness had left his shoulders. He set the page down with both hands carefully, as though it were something fragile enough to break under the wrong kind of touch. Vanessa did not reach for it again. She had already read enough to understand what had happened, or rather what had not. The story she had built, quietly, patiently, piece by piece, had not survived the weight of a simpler truth. Walter had not hidden another family. He had protected a child. The distinction matters more than most people realize. Shame hides itself to avoid consequences. Dignity stays silent to protect someone who did not ask to be born inside another person's failure. And people who live by suspicion rarely understand that difference until they are forced to stand in the full light of what they assumed. Daniel looked up at me, and for the first time that evening he seemed younger. Not childish. Just wounded in the honest way grown sons sometimes are when they realize how quickly they were willing to doubt the person who loved them first. "I didn't know," he said. His voice had changed. It had lost its rehearsed caution, its borrowed certainty. I believed him. That was the hardest part. Because yes, Vanessa had searched. Vanessa had pushed. Vanessa had arranged fragments into a pattern sharp enough to draw blood. But Daniel had followed because some quiet part of him had already been prepared to believe the worst of silence. Across the table, Vanessa sat very still. That was something I had noticed about her years ago. Most people fidget when they are cornered. They reach for a glass, smooth a sleeve, glance toward the door. Vanessa became motionless. Completely motionless. It was the stillness of calculation, of someone deciding which version of herself might still be useful. "I only wanted the truth," she said at last. The words were measured but thinner now. I folded my hands in my lap. "No," I said gently. "You wanted a version of it that made you feel clever for finding it." The room went quiet. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just the kind of silence that settles when pretenses finally lose their usefulness. I looked at the letter again, then at my son. "Your father made mistakes," I said. "But not the one you came here prepared to accuse him of." Daniel lowered his eyes. Outside, the last of the afternoon light had begun to fade from the windows. The roast had gone untouched on half our plates. The lemon tart still sat in its box on the counter, neat and unnecessary. And in the stillness that followed, I understood something with perfect clarity. The truth had not repaired anything, but it had put every heart at the table in its proper place. After they left, I did not clear the table right away. I remained in my chair with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the house settle around me. The front door had closed softly behind them. Daniel's car started a minute later, then disappeared down the street. After that, there was only the quiet again. Not the old quiet I had once mistaken for peace, but a different kind. A stripped-down quiet. One that no longer asked me to pretend. The dining room looked almost untouched. Half-finished plates. Water glasses catching. The last gray light. The letter still resting beside Daniel's chair, where he had set it down as though moving it further might make the truth harder to bear. I reached for it at last and smoothed the page with my fingertips. Walter's handwriting had always been neat. Even in confession, he had written like a man trying to leave no unnecessary disorder behind him. Margaret's child had been connected to Walter's side of the family long before Daniel ever knew her name. There had been need. There had been circumstance. There had been a situation too delicate, too painful, and too tangled in the failures of other adults to be dragged into the open where gossip could get hold of it. Walter had chosen silence. Not to protect himself, but to shield a child from becoming the center of a story she had never asked to be part of. That was the part Vanessa had not understood. To people like her, silence is suspicious because they only recognize secrecy when it is useful. They assume that anything hidden must be shameful, because they do not understand restraint unless it serves ambition. But some silences are not lies. Some are shelters. I stood slowly and began gathering the plates. The roast had gone cold. The gravy had formed a thin skin. Vanessa's lemon tart remained unopened on the counter, bright and polished and unnecessary. I wrapped the leftovers, rinsed the serving spoon, and moved through the kitchen with the quiet steadiness of habit. There was comfort in that. Not denial. Not avoidance. Just the simple dignity of putting a room back in order after something in it had changed. As I washed the last plate, I thought of Daniel. Not as the man who had walked into my house with doubts, but as the boy he used to be. All elbows and scraped knees. Baseball caps. hungry all the time, so eager to trust whatever version of the world was handed to him by the people he loved. That part of him had never fully disappeared. It had only grown taller, worn a tie, and learned to hide its uncertainty behind a deeper voice. He had hurt me. Not with cruelty exactly. Something quieter than that. Something almost more painful. He had been willing to suspect. Willing to step into my home and place a question over the memory of his father before asking what it might cost. But willingness is not the same as malice. And age, if it teaches anything worth keeping, teaches the difference. I dried my hands and turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the maple tree Walter planted when Daniel was born moved gently in the evening wind. For years, I had believed my duty was to protect the peace of this house at any cost. To smooth over discomfort. To keep grief tidy. To let silence do what silence had always done. But peace without truth is only performance. And performance eventually exhausts the person doing all the work. I took the letter upstairs and returned it to the drawer beside my bed. Not hidden this time. Not buried. Simply placed where I could reach it if I needed to. Then I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked around the room I had shared with Walter for most of my life. There was still sorrow there. Of course there was. The dead do not become simple just because time passes. Love does not erase disappointment. Disappointment does not erase love. By the time a woman reaches my age, she understands that two opposite things can sit beside each other for years and never fully cancel one another out. Walter had kept something from me. That was true. He had also, in his imperfect way, tried to protect someone vulnerable from becoming family entertainment. That was also true. And I had been left, as women often are, to sort the moral weight of both. I lay down without turning on the television or opening a book. The house creaked once above me, then settled. In the darkness, I thought about how easily people confuse power with noise. They think strength is the loud voice at the table, the accusation delivered cleanly, the dramatic exit, the triumph everyone can witness. They are wrong. Real strength is quieter. It is the ability to sit in the presence of an ugly suspicion and wait for the full shape of it before you decide what it means. It is knowing when not to defend yourself too quickly. It is recognizing that truth is not made holier by being shouted. It is understanding that dignity does not need an audience. By morning, nothing outside my window would look different. The birds would still gather at the feeder. The coffee would still need brewing. Light would still move slowly across the kitchen floor. But something in me had shifted into its proper place. I no longer needed the past to be innocent in order to live with it. I only needed it to be seen clearly. And sometimes that is the nearest thing to peace a woman can earn. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.